The painting also shows Brunel settlement. In 1849, he was just coming to the end of his involvement in planning and developing his new town. It shows many terraces bracketing a central promenade, and these date from 1842 to 1849. It also shows a church and a park and a school. There are children playing around a maple, and there are adults playing cricket in the park. Brunel was very conscious of appearances, and his cottages facing the railway have been given special architectural treatment, such as arrow slits, diamond set, chimney stacks, everything to make it look as if the railway was an opulent affair. Much of what you see in the painting survives, especially in the railway village, and it now comprises by far the largest collection of historic listed buildings that are ascribed to Brunel. Brunel would have been amazed at how his legacy in Swindon is now being revered. For him to be possibly commemorated by a World Heritage Site comprising the two main conservation areas in Swindon is something beyond his wildest dreams.
At Stroud Station we still find an original Brunel design goods shed. At Bridgewater, the Brunel-designed telescopic, or black bridge, was built to take a railway across the river. It was steam-driven, retracting to allow shipping to pass upstream. Today the bridge is fixed, but is still used by pedestrians. The Bridgewater docks, which were opened in 1841, were also Brunel designed. Beyond Bristol lay the important market town and agricultural centre of Exeter. The first public excursion train was run from Paddington to Exeter in 1844. In 1845, Brunel built his first large wrought iron structure, the Hungerford Footbridge over the Thames in London. This was a suspension bridge with a central span of 676 feet, carried on elegant brick Italianate towers. The bridge was demolished in 1860 to make way for the Charing Cross Railway Bridge. Brunel's pillars were retained to support the walkway alongside the track. The distinctive red brickwork and sandstone dressings are easily recognizable. A new pedestrian link has now been constructed on both sides of the railway, its design echoing Brunel's former suspension bridge. When the line passed through Slough, just a couple of miles from the Queen's residence at Windsor, it made commercial sense to construct a line to Windsor in the hope of royal patronage. The Great Western Railway therefore built an elevated section of track in timber, but this was subsequently rebuilt on brick arches. To cross the river, Brunel built a bow and string style rail bridge upstream from Windsor to carry the gently rising track across the river and up to Windsor Central Station. Brunel's bridge is the oldest wrought iron bridge still in service. Around 1849 he experimented with designs for bridge beams made of riveted wrought iron plate with tubular top flanges. A number of these are known to survive, notably the swing bridge at the Cumberland Basin in Bristol, and the road bridge designed for Queen Victoria at Balmoral. Frome Station on the Wiltshire, Somerset and Weymouth Railway was opened in 1850. Having no pillars, it was self-supporting for 123 years. Brunel's work was built to last. He made a major contribution to the Great Exhibition held in Hyde Park in 1851, leading the building committee with his friend and rival, Robert Stevenson. His proposed design was for a huge iron dome in the centre of the building.
Brunel has two connections with the Crystal Palace. In the Great Exhibition building that was in Hyde Park in 1851, Brunel's involvement was that, first of all, he was one of the advisors to the committee who were deciding which design they would have for the Great Exhibition building. Lots of designs were put forward, none of them were accepted, and Brunel then took all the best ideas, put them together and designed his own building. Paxton came along with his much better design, a big greenhouse, and Brunel helped Paxton when it was decided that some trees that were in the middle of Hyde Park couldn't be cut down. We needed to make the middle of the Crystal Palace a bit higher, which led to the central transept, and Brunel offered to measure the height of those trees. A few years later, Brunel got his own back, because when Paxton moved his Crystal Palace to Sydenham and rebuilt it on a much grander scale, he wanted to have, in the grounds of the Crystal Palace, fountains that outshone the fountains of Versailles. To do this, he needed water towers. Well, Paxton's own design for water towers just didn't work. The water pressure inside would have broken the glass. So he called upon Brunel for help. And Brunel came along and redesigned the towers, much stronger. These water towers regrettably no longer exist, though they survived the fire of 1936.
Miles around, and presently the great transept of the main roof hurtled to the ground, the Crystal Palace's greatest firework display. When day came, the palace grounds presented a gruesome sight. Everywhere lay masses of charred and twisted debris. Shattered glass lay all round in the smouldering remains of London's glass cathedral. This is all that was left of the Exhibition Palace, whose name and fame were known throughout the world.
They were demolished at the beginning of the Second World War.
Now gives its life for its country. Cutting through the cast iron columns and steel girders, demolition experts weaken the foundations and place a 220-pound charge of dynamite. The moment of execution has arrived. At a given signal, the explosive is fired, and up she goes. A great hole is torn in its base, and down comes 1,000 tons of steel and glass.
The great brick bases still survive. And there is a museum dedicated to the history of Crystal Palace close by. The people of Devonshire, witnessing the railway's triumph elsewhere, soon began to demand a further line from Exeter to Plymouth. Brunel was once again called in on what was then known as the South Devon Railway to plan the construction. He decided to pursue the right bank of the Exe to Starcross and then carry the railway along the coast past Dawlish to Teignmouth. Beyond here, the rails were to run along the Tyne bank. The railway was in fact difficult to construct throughout, because the level part along the coast had to be laid between the sea and the cliffs. Delay was caused by the Admiralty raising objections, but these were finally overcome. Work along the side of the Exe was hindered by low tides, preventing boats from landing with material. A great sea wall had to be erected between Teignmouth and Dawlish to protect the railway. And a succession of tunnels were needed to negotiate the coastal terrain. The uphill sections of the line, with some gradients as severe as 1 and 36, presented many problems. He had long been interested in the atmospheric power system as a solution to the successful working of steep gradients. He convinced his directors to give the system a trial. This was the ill-fated atmospheric steam railway, or, as it was unkindly labelled, Brunel's atmospheric cable. The system consisted of a cast-iron pipeline about 20 inches internal diameter laid between the running rails. The pipes had a continuous slot along the upper side to enable an arm connecting to an internal piston with the vehicles to be moved to travel along it. This slot was closed by a continuous hinged leather flap. The piston was attached to the forward end of a long frame, the arm to the rear end. An arrangement of wheels on the frame pushed up the flap in advance of the arm. When the air was exhausted by a pumping station from the end of the pipe, the piston was driven in that direction by atmospheric pressure, hauling the attached vehicle with it. The pipeline was equipped with pumping stations at intervals of 3 miles. When a train was due, the engines exhausted the air, each ceasing to pump as soon as the train had passed. The Italianate architecture created by Brunel can be seen in the pumping stations that still exist, notably at Starcross, which has lost the top section of its tower, but also at Tor, which was built but never used, and also at Totnes. There was one at Exeter St. David's, and the ultimate plan was to continue this system all the way to Plymouth. But unfortunately, this system failed due to the nature of the leather seal, which either froze in winter or overexpanded in summer. It was also rumoured that rodents found the leather and its lubricating tallow absolutely delicious. The trials lasted for less than a year and temporarily injured Brunel's reputation. But in 1848, the Exeter to Plymouth line was opened and the Torquay branch finished. The original terminus was at Tor, with a grand opening ceremony briefly attended by Brunel. Torquay Station was built in 1859 to be rebuilt in 1878. The viaducts were mostly of timber, but had masonry piers 66 feet apart, reaching up to 35 feet below the level of the track. Nearly all these viaducts have since been replaced by brick and steel structures. Here at Ivy Bridge and Glazebrook in South Devon, Brunel's original piers can still be seen.
And so it was on the 2nd of April 1849 that the steam train eventually arrived in Plymouth, here at a station that's been closed and disappeared over 60 years ago now, although it was still used for passenger goods for quite some time. But in 1849 it made a huge impact, not just on Plymouth but on the rest of the world, as the railways were something that Britain could be really, really proud of. Suddenly, for people living here, we were no longer 3 or 4 hours away from Exeter. No longer would it take 21¼ hours by the fastest coach available, the Quicksilver, to get from Plymouth to London. The change was dramatic in the extreme, and suddenly Plymouth was not as isolated as it had been for hundreds and hundreds of years. One of the main reasons the local authority wanted Brunel to site his station at Mill Bay was because of Mill Bay Dock development, which was going alongside it at the same time. They had originally wanted to put Great Western Docks over at Sutton Harbour, but the Admiralty had vetoed the harbour being created around the old part of Plymouth, and instead the last of the inlets to be developed here at Mill Bay became the site of the Great Western Docks. And not only was it the last to be developed in the area, it was the first to be linked by rail to the rest of the country. And he put a pier here. Great Britain pulled up alongside it in 1845, and 2 years later, after many trials and tribulations, the docks were opened at Mill Bay without the usual fanfare. Because it had been such a stressful time, they just kind of opened. But it changed the fortunes of Plymouth, and that meant that Falmouth, which had been the main mail packet station for the southwest for so many years, was suddenly eclipsed, and Southampton, which had got there first in terms of having a rail link with the sea and the land, was suddenly given a new threat as Plymouth came into its own, and hotels, commerce, all followed in the wake of God's wonderful railway.
The next big step forward was the extension of the railway from Plymouth to Truro, and finally Penzance. The line had to be taken through difficult terrain, and the chief characteristics of its construction were the 34 timber viaducts which had to be built over deep valleys. In 1853, work also began on Brunel's most ambitious maritime project, the SS Great Eastern. She was conceived as the biggest steamship yet built, one that would be capable of carrying 4,000 passengers, or up to 10,000 troops at a time, on a non-stop trip to Australia. Besides her steam engines, she could accommodate more than 5,000 square meters of sail. After a fatal and abortive first attempt, she was eventually launched at Millwall in 1858, and many years ahead of her time, was not a commercial success. The SS Great Eastern proved uneconomic as a passenger ship, but had a new lease of life when she was used to lay the first successful transatlantic telegraph cable. Remains of her timber launching ways can still be seen at Millwall on the Isle of Dogs. With some of the original buildings in what was John Scott Russell's yard, now known as Burrell's Wharf. He also designed a large floating barge to take the heavy guns needed in the Crimean War, as well as a prefabricated field hospital. From the early 1840s, Brunel had often taken family holidays in the West Country, and in 1847 he began to search for a property to buy, an estate fit for a gentleman, eventually purchasing land at Watcombe, overlooking Babbacombe Bay, where he became a model landlord, building a chapel and cottages for his staff. Brunel was deeply immersed in his Watcombe adventure, keeping a detailed notebook and sketches with plans of the estate and records of the annual growth of its trees and shrubs. After a series of further purchases, the estate totaled a huge 136 acres. He commissioned a number of designs in the French chateau and Italianate styles, but sadly, he died before building could be started, although a house, now known as Brunel Manor, was built on the existing foundations in the 1850s. Although he never lived in it, he helped to design the formal gardens, and the house retains some of his original design. In the year of his bicentenary, extensive restoration is being carried out on the landscape gardens with the aim of returning them to their former glory. In the nearby Brunel woods are some unusual wooden carvings, including a totem pole depicting Brunel's lifetime achievement. His final and perhaps his greatest engineering achievement was the Royal Albert Bridge at Saltash.
It was Isambard's greatest achievement, but it was almost his father's. But his father didn't feel that a crossing could be created here. And certainly Isambard's first inclination was for a steam ferry. But the Admiralty said, no, it has to be a fixed crossing. So he came up with a 7-span wooden bridge, but the Admiralty wouldn't allow that. The single-span bridge that he proposed next was too expensive, and so this was the design that was accepted. But even then, it didn't happen too quickly because money, again, was a major issue. It was an incredible feat of engineering, approved after the Clifton project, but that took so long to get off the ground that Brunel actually used the suspension chain for the Clifton Bridge in this project here. And it wasn't just the other engineers that were in awe of the work that he was doing here either. When the first big arch was floated into place, Plymouth and the surrounding villages and towns took a day's holiday. 30 to 40,000 people descended on the tiny community of Saltash, and they cleaned the place out in terms of food, drink. Horse and cabs were charging 6 times what they would normally charge. People just flocked to see this awe-inspiring piece of engineering happen, move into place. From start to finish it took about 10 years, with work being suspended for about 3 due to financial difficulties, and when it eventually opened, the Prince Consort Albert came down to view the bridge that was named and officially open the bridge that was named in his honour. Brunel himself was too ill to attend and only saw it virtually on his deathbed. He was placed on a mattress on an open truck and came down to see it some 6 weeks before he left this mortal coil.
The completion of the Saltash Bridge meant that a continuous run from London to Truro was now possible. A branch line to Falmouth and Penzance was opened in 1853. By the time the Royal Albert Bridge was opened, Brunel was very ill with what is thought to have been Bright's disease. Undoubtedly, his heavy smoking must have contributed to his decline in health. He travelled to Italy and Egypt to convalesce, but returned to take charge of the SS Great Eastern project. While on board, the day before the first sea trials, the 5th of September 1859, in his son's words, he felt symptoms of failing power. He had to be taken home with possible heart-related problems. Paralyzed at his home in Duke Street, he heard news of an on-board explosion. He died within a week, on the 15th of September, 1859. Aged 53, and he was buried at Kensal Green Cemetery. In his memory, a 9-foot bronze statue by Carlo Baron Moroschetti was placed on the Victoria Embankment near Temple Station. Perhaps the most moving tribute was written by his friend and colleague Daniel Gooch. By his death, the greatest of England's engineers was lost. The man of the greatest originality of thought and power of execution, bold in his plans, but right. The commercial world thought him extravagant, but although he was so, great things are not done by those who sit down and count the cost of every thought and act. He was a true and sincere friend, a man of the highest honor, and his loss was deplored by all who had the pleasure to know him.
Ladies and gentlemen, those of you who have glasses, please raise them in a toast to Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Okay, we're ready to count down. Are you ready, kids?